And before I'd figured that out, he had me doing structural design of the hull, and then again in a very short time handed me the chief designer role. In a 4-year period he got me almost ready to do it on my own, but he was still there for guidance when I needed it. He stressed several characteristics that he loved, like how to draw a perfect shear line and how to relate prismatic coefficient with other design characteristics that make a sailboat stand out. It sure was good teaching, and I can still pick out a C&C shear line in a crowd from a long distance or from strange angles. Even after several years under my belt, I still needed to explain what would be unique in a new design. And a good example was the design of Majesty, where it was a very specific custom design. I needed to make George a believer, and eventually he blessed the project, which went on to be one of my own personal best. He always kept looking forward. For example, he suggested to me that sailboats would eventually look a lot like radio-controlled models. You'll remember at the time they had deep skinny keels with a lead bulb on the bottom. And guess what? Many of the boats we see today look very similar to that many years later. As much as custom designs were notable, it was production boats that paid our way. And George imbibed the message that they are much more challenging design-wise, since performance is important, but attractiveness and practicality for the builder and the sailor was actually the key to successful designs. George was key in helping me balance the various factors that would result in many people wanting to sail our boats. He told me at the time of his retirement from the design office that the Cuthbertson clan did not live long lives, so a change from him was maybe a good idea. But he sure put that suggestion to rest as he continued to guide us and the company for many years to amazing heights. No one could ask for a more fantastic career path than I had, and it was all because of George's faith in me. He taught me all the secrets of yacht design, and I tried hard to follow his guidance from day one. Okay, I've got 2 or 3. Okay, I have a submission here from Barry Carroll, who was the production manager at C&C Rhode Island and owner of Carroll Marine subsequent to that. From Barry: I was privileged to work for C&C Yachts when they started C&C in Middletown. As a youngster just starting in the business, I was exposed to some of the best and brightest in the marine industry in the 70s and 80s. Mike Spicer, George Cassian, Rob Ball, Rob Mazza, Rod Gerard, and George Hinterhaller were all role models. Terry Connolly was general manager of C&C down there, and he was larger than life. But big George Cuthbertson was the straw that stirred the drink. He was reserved and a big intimidating factor to a 24-year-old kid. He could stop conversation in the room when he looked over the top of his glasses. He could also light up the day with a quiet, nicely done. I was fortunate to be exposed to such an amazingly talented group of boat builders, led by such an accomplished individual. George, you're missed. Another one from Skip Doyle, who's an old friend of George and Helen's. Big George and I first met when we were teenagers. He was still in the RCYC Junior Club, crewing on the 6-meter Mermaid. I crewed on a couple different 6s from Youngstown Yacht Club that frequently crossed the lake to race in Toronto, and we became friends. We remained good friends until his passing. My last communication from him was May 31st, this year, when he sent me a magazine article written by Rob Mazza titled Lake Ontario's 8-Meter Revival. We'll all miss this good guy. I think my last short sentence tells how many of us felt, forgetting all about his great talent. He was a real good guy. Ted Brewer, many of you know, started with Canadian Northern in 1956, fresh out of the Navy, as a yacht broker. In early summer of 1960, I'd completed my design course and wanted to get more experience. I heard about an opening with Bill Luders in Stamford, Connecticut. So I asked both George and Dick Telford if I should do it, and they told me to go for it. I did, and to many of my amazement, I was hired. Without George's advice, help, and encouragement, I would never have had a chance in that position. Those years with George Cuthbertson at Canadian Northern were my start for a long and fascinating career in yacht and small craft design. I remained friends with George for the rest of his life and enjoyed his occasional comments on my design. A short one from Peter Blacklock. George was one of the giants of our industry whose presence got the best from all who worked with him. He was always the adult in the room. It was my pleasure and privilege to be part of the C&C team. Okay, Steve, you're up.
I'll introduce myself. My name is Steve Killing. I'm also an alumni of the C&C Design Office and was hired directly by George. So I think it's kind of nice that we're getting to learn some of the personal side of George here and the influence that he had on individuals, not just the boats that he designed and built, but his influence on the lives of a number of people. So I think grateful is the word I would best use to describe my feelings towards George. When I was 17, I wrote a letter to George Cuthbertson when I had learned there's this occupation of yacht design, and asked for his advice in how to get into the field. So he wrote me a letter that, that decision to write that and his response ultimately defined my whole career path in life. That sounds incredibly dramatic, but it's absolutely true. So I wrote that letter, and he had no doubt written a response to many young people. And his recommendation was to get a degree in engineering, start working in a boat building yard, and sort of slide into design in that way. And his quote from that letter was, "It's a small field, but there's always room at the top." So, only slightly discouraged, I went off to university and got my engineering degree. And then when I graduated, I wrote back to George and said, "I'm ready for my practical now." So he called me in for an interview. I was terribly intimidated. This big guy, deep voice, brush cut. So we went through the interview process, and then I was expecting sometime later on to get a response. But at the end of the interview, he said, "Okay, let's try this for a month and see how it goes." So that 1 month job stretched into 7 years. All my education was on the job. So during that time, George did his best to manage the office full of these people you have met, over-exuberant, I would call them, young designers. We really thought that racing was the only thing that mattered in sailboats. And so as he moved from head designer to president, and then he retired for a while and then came back as president, he continued to check on the boats that we were creating. And the sign of a good manager, I think, is one that gives you enough freedom to feel a pride in the product you're producing. But in reality, I think George gave us a little too much freedom. So we needed reining in a little bit. We had this total focus on racing, and, well, it wasn't really that important about other things. So George kept coming back to the fact that, even people that buy these boats, they're incredible. They dream of racing, but really what they do is they go cruising. So the interior is important, the visuals are important, and he finally drove that home to us. So in that time period, we spent a lot of time designing, a lot of late nights. We were drawing drawings by hand at that point, and often the office cleanup got neglected at the end of the day. I recall arriving one morning after a late night to find a large note on top of my shambles of my desk that said, "Your desk is a mess. GHC." So I took this note around to Rob Mazza in the next cubicle, and indeed he was standing with the same note in his desk. So George had Xeroxed this and put it on everybody's desk. So to this day, so I actually love working in an absolutely tidy office, and I still have trouble maintaining that But when the stacks get high, I always think of that little note from George. So George's other lesson to us was delivered in a design meeting, which he called us all together, and it was entitled "The Stewardship of Company Funds." I had no idea what that meant. And that was an indicator that he needed to give us the talk. He was stressing the fact that even though we enjoyed our jobs, we were not working in a vacuum. The money we spent, the research we did, and yes, even the mistakes that we made, all were accountable and had a cost to the company. So his advice was intended to help C&C Yachts and their bottom line, but in fact he was helping us become better citizens of the world. So those were, even though we didn't take it well at the time, incredibly good lessons. So my own yacht design career has now spanned almost 45 years, and it's no exaggeration to say that I owe it all to Big George. From my first letter, to my first job, to my yacht design education on the job, and finally to his support once I started my own company, he's always been a willing ear. And I always let George and Helen know my gratitude. So thank you again, George. So I too have a few more tributes to read. This one's from Howie McMichael of McMichael Yachts in New York. This is another fact for Rob Mazza to check out. This is he claims to have sold the most C&C yachts in Long Island Sound than any other broker. Oh, you claim that? Okay, that's endorsed. Endorsed fact. So he writes, I recall a visit to George's home where he had a swimming pool. He enjoyed diving in and coasting across the pool, and I thought at the time he was probably thinking about the friction of the water on his body and how to use it. He was a quiet but brilliant man, and I had a great deal of admiration for him as a person. He certainly made his mark in the sailboat industry and influenced future designers' thoughts. He built safe, beautiful yachts that would be owned, enjoyed, and sailed many miles by owners and their families. We still have several in our yard that we have sold to their third or fourth owner. The thing that most distinguished C&C Yachts from their competitors was the level of quality, not only in the boats themselves, but throughout the entire company. In those days, you could trust what a manufacturer said! Exclamation. George was a man I knew was as straight as they come, and you could take his word to the bank. The next one is from Don Finkel, RCR Yachts. So RCR Yachts was in Youngstown. It was only in Youngstown at the time, back in the 70s, and sold a number of C&C yachts. Don writes, I'm a most fortunate man because I joined the sailing industry in 1971, a time when it was really taking off. Our dealership handled several lines of boats, but C&C was our flagship brand. Red Jacket's accomplishments were still fresh in everyone's mind. During the 1970s, we knew many of the key players. The one we recall who cast the largest shadow was Big George. I was a young fellow in my 20s at the time, and George was such an imposing figure. The combination of his presence, his reputation, his confidence, and his stature left no doubt who was in charge. C&C had so many good and talented people working there over the years, but Big George stands out in my mind as the most memorable and the right man at the right time. And one more short one. This is from Hank Evans, who actually worked for George. I met George in the late 70s while looking for a Canadian company to manufacture the car-top sailboat line that I represented in the States. I was soon working for C&C, and a couple of years later working directly for George as project manager on the Mega. I was in awe of this legendary designer, but also soon realized that I was working for a truly great leader. George had a firm vision for the company, an ability to effectively use the talents of his people, the courage of his convictions, and a very firm hand on the helm. He personally steered C&C Yachts to the success it achieved. He taught me a great deal about management and leadership that stood me in good stead for my next 30 years in the business. We had stayed in touch for all the years since then. It was an honor and a privilege to work for this fine man and to call him a friend. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Steve, thanks, Rob. That's the end of the scripted portion of the presentation. I with great hesitation, I wonder if we should go off script and ask if anybody in the room would like to say a few words about George and what he meant to their lives. And Mr. Henderson's hand goes up right away.
Hey, just a short thing. I'm sorry, but I think I knew George longer than anybody else here. As you know, I don't usually play by the rules. And the junior club of the RCYC had a rule that you had to be 10 years old. For some unknown reason, they got me in when I was 9. And George Cuthbertson, by that time, was 14. And I had an older brother who was about the size of George. And George always called me for 70 years, Little Henderson. But when it was a rainy day or there was no wind, we'd all sit around George when he was 14, and he'd tell us all the history of all the boats and all the designs and what they were like. And he was 14 then. Then what happened, fast track to 1981, we were building this club. And I got a telephone call from the historical board that the grandson of Commodore of the Royal Canadian Yacht Club had given 21 models to the historical board. That was the only Commodore who I think ever ended up in jail, although a lot more should have. So I phoned up George and I said, we got to go down to the historical board and see these models. He called it the hysterical board, so down we went, and there were 21 half models that had been in the fire of the 1918 of our clubhouse on the island. And George was like a kid in a candy store. Because some of the models, although he knew all the names and knew the history, he didn't really know what they were looked like, because the Commodore had stolen those 21 models and kept them until his grandkid had no idea what to do with them and give them to the historical board. And they gave them back to the Royal Canadian Yacht Club. And if you go over into the corner of the model room, I tried to take it down to show you, but I couldn't get it down. You'll notice there is a model on the left hand up at the top that the paint is all mottled on, because that's how it came out of the fire. And George said, let's not refurbish that one. Let's put that up so everybody knows that our models were singed in the fire of 1918. What a great guy George Cuthbertson was.
Does anyone else want to say a few words?
Well, I forgot one thing.
Kirby, that design of the quarter tonner was because Dr. Roger Green and myself, who were 14-foot dinghy sailors, got Bruce Kirby to design his first boat. And this is the first time I ever knew that Kirby phoned Cuthbertson to find out how to design the boat.
Rob. That's a secret. Alf?
Yeah.
I'll bring the mic to you.
We've heard today all the business aspects of George and how he modeled so many boats, famous boats. But the same with me as Henderson. We sailed in 14-foot dinghies, and as did George. And in one instance, he sailed in the Turnbull Trophy, which is a team race between the clubs in the Toronto area. And he sailed on with Joan Burt, who many of you might remember. She was an excellent dinghy sailor. And George was very much a part of 14-foot dinghies and the actual sailing of the dinghies. And I enjoyed that time with him. In fact, I guess the last time I spoke with him was last fall at Shellbacks, and we had a short conversation. He was a great guy.
All right.
Now,
I don't know whether I need a microphone or not because my last name is Gooderham, but I have three very of my fondest stories about Big George. One was I missed it from behind, and I'll get to it by the end of the week, George, or by next Wednesday at the latest. But one time we were doing some work on an 8-meter, which Commodore Howard had sailed in and had won the Canada's Cup, and the bow had been changed. And Big George said to me, he said, "Brian, I'll help you as long as you put the bow back the way it is. And if you don't, I'm not going to help." Well, a couple of weeks later, these drawings arrive and everything with the way it was, plus a full-size template, because George said, in case you can't use your scale, Brian, or figure it out, just hold it up and tell it to make it look like that. Well, I thought, and that was his way of sort of guiding. Right. And that was great. And then he came at least once a week to check and make sure that everything was happening properly. And so I very much remember that. And another one was I had lunch with George, and I had mentioned this to, I don't know whether it was Paul Zuban or somebody afterwards, and they said, well, who else was there? And I said, oh, it's just Big George and I. And he had his usual list. And Paul says, you had lunch with Yoda. that was very telling. And the other one was when we were looking for a little more performance, and George being forward thinking, we made Red Jacket a masthead kite spinnaker. And Red Jacket, of course, has evolved, her mast being almost 10 feet taller now than it was originally. And there was this drawing with this masthead kite, and Big George says to me, he says, Brian, I don't know how you're going to steer that when it blows, but good luck and let me know how it works.
I can give you a little bit more of history. George was 14 when his father died. His mother moved from Brantford into West Toronto. George had a bicycle. He came home one day and said, Mom, I've got a job. I've got a job at the Taylor Boat Works. They're going to hire me to work building boats. His mother said, George, you are not going to work for Taylor Boat Works. You are not going to spend the rest of your life building boats. So he didn't work there. He went instead, as his mother ordered him, to the Junior Yacht Club. He was 14, rather old for the club. He was sailing there a couple of years later with Jimmy Highland, a very well-known RCYC sailor, a beautiful man, in a little 6-meter yacht. They were at a dock when a beautiful white sloop pulled in and berthed alongside him. On board were people he didn't know. One was Norman Walsh, who a few years later gave him the order of the biggest yacht he'd ever conceived in his life. The second was Perry Connolly, and the third was, who was the third one, Beth?
Cliff Strange.
Eh?
Cliff Strange. Cliff Strange.
No, not Cliffy Strange. No, he's Peter Davidson. Peter Davidson, Norman Walsh, and the other guy who joined him for the rest of his working life. Quite remarkable.
Yeah.
Did he also design the little dinghies to put our tooties in?
No, I can't speak to that. They're not fiberglass though, are they?
No.
But he did do some metal boats.
At the end.
Anybody else? All right. I mentioned at the beginning how many lives George touched and how many careers he influenced, not only in yacht design, but just as a very straightforward individual. You know, Rob, Steve, and I wouldn't be where we are today if it hadn't been George paving the way for us, so we could actually follow in a career path that he had established virtually on his own. We've heard a lot of stories today about how George, what influence George had on us, and I think we can all appreciate the toast that we made at the beginning to a life well lived. And I thank you all for coming with us today to celebrate George. And I think Jill has a few words to say.
Hi, thank you very much. I want to thank everybody for respecting the privacy that my father and my mother requested. We appreciate it, and we're very grateful to see everybody here. George would have been happy that you bent the rules. He really would have. This is from my mother, the most beautiful woman in the world. My parents were the most glamorous people in my eyes. I think they actually were now that I see the photos. So this is my mom, Helen Cuthbertson. Thank you all for coming today, and a special thank you to Rob Mazza and to Shellbacks for arranging this affair. Our friendly giant has gone. Our George was a very private man. He didn't want a big fuss when he died. It was all written down in the brown book. I should have shown Rob that brown book. I think he thought I would go first, as he left an obit for me in the brown book. That's George left the obit, not Many of you probably don't even know we have two sons, Michael and John Kelly, and Jill, George's beloved daughter, two great daughter-in-laws, and a super son-in-law. 3 beautiful granddaughters and 2 grandsons. He was proud of them all, and we actually did get to see him, despite it looks like he was around boats the whole time. George was also proud of his design staff. The 2 Robs, Ball and Mazza, Steve Killing, and many more that went on to other employment and endeavors. Also, he was very fond of Michael Carter and David Ward in his financial world, and several salespeople. Thank you to all the people who were his friends, customers, and those that encouraged him over the years, such as David and Beth Howard. So many have died in the past few years, school buddies from UTS and fellow mechanical engineers from U of T, business friends and associates. George Stowe, they went back to RCYC sailing school at the age of 14 or 15. That would have been 1943 or 44. His friend Perry Connolly, who died 4 days before George. This dwelt on his mind over the last few days and weeks. It was very much on his mind as he and Perry talked on the phone at least once a week over the past few years. Thank you all again for the many cards and good wishes our family have received. And I want to say, we got photocopies too.
Thank you, Jill. I think that's a perfect note to end the Shellbacks presentation for today. Hand it back to Diane.
Rob? There was one thing from the Reverend Julie. Did you watch it? She asked. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Marguerite Byron. I work at the Broadridge Foundation, and George and Helen were philanthropists who supported our charity, for which we're very grateful, hence my reason for sharing the honor of your company and his memories. The Reverend Judith of the Mission extends her apology. She couldn't stay, but she had written a prayer, and we sailors often believe. So with her permission, I have the privilege and honor of reading that prayer with you. If you would please join me in sharing. O Lord, we gather to give you thanks for the life and great spirit of George Cuthbertson. We are grateful for the warmth and kindness he shared with us. and his dedication to family. His inspiration to the sport will live on forever in the hearts of all who knew him. We thank you, Lord, for our memories of George. These we will cherish always. We celebrate his life with joy and sadness, but knowing that today is only a farewell. Until we meet again, fair sailing and amen.
Thank you, Marguerite. Again, I thank everybody for being here. It's interesting, I only met George as a shellback. I did not know of all of his history and how much he affected so many people. And I have to say that he was very fortunate to have family around him who supported him so well through the years. It was a delight to learn about what he has done and how much he has influenced the sailing world, both here in Canada and in the United States. So we wish you well, George. I know you're in a good place now, and we're here for you. We'll think about you. You will be missed. We usually end off with Shellbacks by presenting a little token of appreciation to our speakers. And I'm going to give, I think I have 9 of them there. If you would hand them out to the folks who presented here today. It's just a little token that we give to all of our speakers, and it was a privilege to have you speaking, and we would like you to remember us. And remember that you are Shellbacks now, and we would like you to join us of a Wednesday if you are free. And next week we have Don Ferguson, who's a former manager of QCYC, and he's now representative for Lee Sales of Hong Kong. And he will take us along the Amalfi Coast. And the following week we have Moose Milk, which is our annual Christmas event we hold at Memico Cruising Club. And if you haven't signed up, but you are interested in joining us, I do have a sign-up list here, which I will put out on the table. And I guess the last thing I want to ask you to do, if you didn't do it, there is a guest book that is on the table as you exit. If you haven't signed it, I would appreciate it if you would do that, so that the family may take that guest book with them. And I asked Rob, is the family going to be getting all those lovely speeches that were given? And yes, they are. So you will have all of those speeches. And with that, pipes out. Thank you.